Mnemonics are clever memory techniques that help you remember anything from pin codes to Chinese characters. Good mnemonics can make learning easier, but bad ones can distract you or even hold you back. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how not to learn Chinese characters. We're going to analyze bad mnemonics of different kinds with the aim of learning how to actually use mnemonics to learn and remember characters properly. For more about what to stay away from when learning and or teaching Chinese characters, check out episode 3 of the podcast, How to Not Teach Chinese Characters to Beginners, a 12-step approach. As usual, I will put links to relevant articles and episodes in the show notes, including a link to the written version of this episode. This is extra relevant for this episode because we are going to analyze bad examples of mnemonics, and they usually involve pictures. And for obvious reasons, I can't show them to you in an audio-only format, even though I will describe them well enough that you can listen to this episode without also looking at the pictures in the written version. Before we talk about how not to use mnemonics and look at some bad examples, I think it's a good idea to briefly talk about what mnemonics are and how they should be used. My goal here is not to convince you that mnemonics are bad, merely that there are mnemonics that are bad and that you should stay away from those. So a mnemonic is a memory technique that you can use to store information and then make it more likely that you can retrieve it later. Let's look at a simple example in Chinese. So let's say that you want to learn to write the character Qiu, meaning autumn. The simplest way to do this is just to write the strokes over and over until you've committed them to memory. Essentially, you are regarding this character as a jumble of strokes, and purely by repetition, you learn how to write those strokes and form the correct character. This type of rote learning is really bad and horribly inefficient though, and a much better approach here would be to look at the components and notice that we have grain on the left and fire on the right. Learning these components is well worth your while because they appear in many other characters that you can use the same trick for. The memory technique bit here is not understanding the character, that's always a good idea, but rather to connect the meaningful components in some way. For example, you can think of a wildfire sweeping across a field of grain ready for the autumn harvest. Next time you want to write Qiu, you know that it means autumn, and you think of this wildfire sweeping through the grain, and you know that the components grain and fire are used, and thus you're able to write the character. This can be incredibly powerful, and while I don't recommend you doing this for every single character you want to learn, it's awesome when there are characters that just refuse to stick or you want to really make sure you remember something. This is not the episode to talk about this properly, but we did talk about mnemonics very recently, namely in episode 293, so please check out that episode for more about how to train your memory as a learner of Chinese. In this episode, I want to focus on bad mnemonics, and you might think, wait, what's a bad mnemonic? Isn't that just a mnemonic that doesn't work? And can't that be highly individual, what we find easy or hard to remember? Yes, that is true, and I often stress the importance of having personal mnemonics because what works for you might not work for somebody else. Or if you try to find inspiration from somebody else who says a specific mnemonic works really well, that doesn't guarantee that it works for you. However, I think there are mnemonics that are objectively bad, or at least types of mnemonics that are objectively bad and that you should stay away from. This doesn't mean that these mnemonics will never work, but it does mean that if they work, it's in spite of how they were designed, not thanks to it. We're going to look at 3 types of problems. So first we have ignoring the real story behind the character even when it's helpful. Second, violating or hiding the structure of Chinese characters. And third, not matching the shape of the character with the shape of the image. So let's start with ignoring the real story behind the character even when it's helpful. Chinese characters did not appear randomly or magically out of nothing, but rather they have evolved over thousands of years, and there is usually a story behind each character, and this story often makes sense even today. This is not always the case. Sometimes the etymology of a character is very convoluted or maybe unknown, and even if you could learn everything there was to learn about it, that might be interesting, but it might not be time well spent if your only goal is to remember how to read and write the character. It's important to remember that as students of Chinese, we don't want to learn one single character, we want to learn hundreds or thousands of characters. This is why ignoring the real explanation of a character can be detrimental to your learning, because maybe you make this character easier to learn, but what if you make subsequent characters harder to learn as a result? Let's look at an example, and if you want to look at the picture here, you can go to the written article on Hacking Chinese, to which I've put a link in the show notes. But for those who are listening only, it's a picture of a boy eating an ice cream with the character 吃, to eat, superimposed on it. The square on the left then forms the ice cream itself, and the right part of the character is the boy's nose and mouth. The problem with this mnemonic is not that it will make this particular character harder to learn. I think it might actually help, but it will make subsequent characters harder to learn because you're ignoring the character components. In this picture, the left part, the square, is an ice cream, but this character obviously doesn't mean ice cream, it means mouth or opening. It is a very productive character component, meaning that it appears in many Chinese characters, and guess what? It never means ice cream. So if you learn how to write 吃 by picturing this boy with the ice cream, it effectively means that the rest of the characters using this same component will be harder to learn. I mean, you could in theory use ice cream for all these cases, but I'm not sure why you would do that. It does have a readily available meaning that is also very transparent and easy to see. It means mouth. So if you're going to create a mnemonic for this character, it makes sense to just use mouth because that is the real explanation. Another way to put it is that if you rely on your imagination to conjure up a picture of a boy eating an ice cream, this only relies on things you knew about the Chinese writing system before you came up with that mnemonic. But if you look the character up and learn that the left part is mouth, you have learned something new about the writing system, which will probably, in most cases, and definitely in this case, be useful later. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't use your imagination, it just means you should apply it to things that are already there, if possible. Like I said earlier, the real explanation of a character doesn't always make sense, or it might be very complicated to the point where it's useless for you as an individual learner. In these cases, it's great to use your imagination and come up with something on your own, but at least look at the right explanation first and see if that's helpful. This brings us to the next category of bad mnemonics, which is violating or hiding the structure of Chinese characters. To put it briefly, these mnemonics are bad because they merge things that are supposed to be separate. So for example, in a compound, there might be two identifiable parts, but if you treat them as one part, or if you slice the character up in a way which isn't the way it was originally structured, you stop yourself from learning more about the character, and as we said earlier, you will also make it harder to learn subsequent characters. So in the written article on Hacking Chinese, there is a picture with a mnemonic for the character zhu, meaning pig. This is essentially a cartoon pig looked at from the side, where the left part of the character zhu is vaguely attached to the snout of the pig and the mouth of the pig, but the rest of the character has nothing to do with the picture itself. This mnemonic also fits in the previous category, because of course nothing on the pig itself has anything to do with the real explanation of the character zhu, but that is not what I want to point out here. Instead, I want to focus on the fact that zhu is a compound character with two parts, but this picture makes it look like it's one character, it's one unit, not a compound. The real explanation of this character is that the left part means dog, and that the right part is a sound component. The sound component is zhe, and while the pronunciation in modern Mandarin is not identical to zhu, pig, it's still clear that these were the same once, or at least related enough that this was used as a sound component. Treating a compound as a unit is extremely bad, especially if both parts of the compound are useful on their own or appear in other characters, which is the case here. For example, when you want to learn other animals, such as cat, at least in simplified Chinese, wouldn't it be useful to know that this left part of zhu is the animal component and that it appears in many animal names? And when you get to the character for cat and want to learn that, are you then going to take a cartoon image of a cat and just write the character Mao on it, or how are you going to remember that? In the mnemonic we're looking at here, the left part was just a part of the pig's face, but that's not going to work for other animals. And it could be argued that it doesn't work for pig either, because like I said, the character zhu has very little to do with this cartoon drawing of a pig. A good rule of thumb is that your mnemonic should have as many functional components as the character does. So if the character has two parts in a compound, your mnemonic should have two parts. Again, the point here is not to say that you have to be a purist and always respect the real explanation of a character, but rather to point out that if you ignore the structure of compounds, you will make subsequent compounds harder to learn. Because as I've said, these components do occur again and again, and so attaching meaning to them and using that meaning in your mnemonic is essential. We have now reached the third category of bad mnemonics, which is not matching the shape of the character with the shape of the image. I already mentioned that I thought that the character Zhu had little to do with the drawing of the pig in the previous example, and this is then a case of the shape of the character not matching the shape of the image. To understand the problem here, we need to think about what the purpose of a mnemonic is and how do you use it. And there are, in essence, two ways of using a mnemonic. You can know the meaning and use the mnemonic to remember how to write the character, or you can perhaps look at the written character and let the mnemonic do the job of helping you retrieving the meaning of this character. So for example, if we take my example with autumn earlier, if you want to write that character and you remember the field of grain set ablaze, you can use this information to write the character, assuming then that you know how to write fire and grain, but these are more basic components that you've probably learned by the time you get to autumn. You could also, in theory at least, do the opposite. You see the character Qiu, you notice that it contains grain and fire, and you then think of your autumn harvest being burnt up, and then you remember autumn. Of these, I think using mnemonics to remember how to write characters is both more useful and more common, so I'm going to focus on that case here. A problem here then is that if you use an image, you need to make sure that this image actually helps you recall how to write the character. So for example, you want to write the character for pig, Zhu, and you think of that cute cartoon picture of a pig. Does that then allow you to write the character? I would say almost certainly no, because there is no connection whatsoever between the right part of this character and the picture. It is essentially just a picture of a pig with the character Zhu superimposed on it, and only the left part vaguely matches the shape of the pig. To illustrate this point, I've found a few egregious cases and put them in the written article on Hacking Chinese. These are not standalone Chinese characters, but rather symbols used in Zhuyin, which is a transcription system, but the principles are the same as if it were a normal character. The symbol in question is for the sound m, or written with an m in pinyin. And we have two versions here. First we have a picture of a girl, and it says little sister, and then we have this symbol written on top of it. We also have a cat with this symbol written on it. And you might now think that, wait, how can the same shape be used to describe these very different things, a small girl and a cat? And the answer is that they have nothing in common. It's just a picture of a girl and a picture of a cat, and we have this m symbol written over them. It has zero connection with the picture underneath the character. There is a third example with a hat with this same symbol written on it, and then the symbol actually matches the underlying image. I should say that all these words in Mandarin are pronounced with M at the beginning, and this is of course why these words were chosen and why the pictures were chosen. But how are these mnemonics really meant to help the learner remember how to write the symbol? Well, first you need to connect the symbol with little sister or cat, and this is okay because it goes via the pronunciation, as I said. So you might think, oh, how do I write the symbol? Oh right, it's the one that is the beginning of words like mei mei and mao. So now you're thinking about these words, and this is supposed to make you remember how to write the symbol. Or perhaps the opposite, when you see the symbol, you're meant to think of mei mei and mao, and thereby figuring out that it stands for the sound M. This is deeply problematic because the shape of the images have nothing to do with the shape of this symbol. One is just arbitrarily written on top of the other. This is not true, however, for the last example, which was hat or mao in Chinese. Here again then we have the same start sound, which was the point, but the picture of a hat is also directly related to this symbol, which again then is a square with the bottom removed, and even if you don't see the picture, you can think that this could be the top of a hat. I think we can do better though. If I were to just invent something, I would use the character men, meaning door, which is visually very similar to this Zhuyin character, and also starts with an M. To make sure our newly formed mnemonic here doesn't fall into any of the other categories of bad mnemonics, we should also look at the origin of this symbol. As it happens, it is a rather common character component, which is written the same as this Zhuyin symbol, except with the vertical strokes much shorter. This character isn't used on its own, but it is a rather common character component, which meaning is usually given as a lid. The real explanation here is a little bit tricky because we also have another component that means building or roof, which is the same but with a dot on it, and this first symbol is sometimes an abbreviation of the second. And maybe this can serve as an example of the real explanation sometimes being a little bit more complex than we would prefer. So the conclusion for this specific symbol is that using cat or little sister is just stupid. But using hat is okay. Using door, I think, is the best option because it's so close and easy to use. Or if you want to be really picky and learn the real story behind the character, then think of it as lid. Before we leave the topic of 注音 and wrap up this episode, I would like to point to episode 221, which is called How to Learn 注音 or bopomofo in 2 hours, and this also contains mnemonics and how to use them. So in conclusion, yes, while it is to a certain extent true that whatever works is good, but I also think that there are several ways in which mnemonics can be objectively bad. Not necessarily for learning a specific character, but for learning the Chinese writing system in general. When you browse mnemonics online, it's important to realize that people create mnemonics for many different reasons. Maybe they should look cute to attract kids, maybe they should look useful even though they aren't, or sometimes the designer just doesn't know any better. Anyway, I hope you come away from this episode with a little bit more critical thinking when it comes to mnemonics. Don't just grab whatever you find when you search for an image online, but instead try to learn characters in a way that not only helps you memorize this character, but which also deepens your understanding of the Chinese writing system and helps you learn hundreds or thousands of characters. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.